Three demons that will stop your prayer. Beloved, prayer was never designed to be weak. It was never meant to be uncertain, empty, or powerless. Prayer is a divine system established by God Himself, and it works every time it is approached correctly. When prayer appears to fail, it is not because heaven is silent, it is because something on the human side is interfering. Today we will expose three demons, three spiritual forces that do not stop God from answering, but stop believers from receiving. Demon number one, unbelief. Unbelief is not merely doubting God's power, it is doubting God's word. Faith begins where the will of God is known and the will of God is revealed through His word. When a believer prays without confidence in what God has already said, that prayer loses spiritual authority. Prayer without faith becomes hope. Hope is good, but hope does not receive. Faith receives. Unbelief speaks quietly but destructively. What if it doesn't work? Maybe it's not God's will. I tried before. Unbelief neutralizes prayer because prayer is activated by faith. Faith is not an emotion. It is a decision to stand on truth regardless of circumstances. The moment you doubt what God has spoken, you surrender your authority. Faith does not wait to see. It speaks because it knows. Demon number two, unforgiveness. Unforgiveness is one of the most dangerous spiritual conditions a believer can carry. It poisons prayer from the inside. When unforgiveness is present, prayer becomes restricted. Not because God refuses to hear, but because the heart is divided. Unforgiveness places the believer in spiritual contradiction, asking for mercy while withholding mercy, asking for grace while refusing grace. Unforgiveness gives legal ground to spiritual resistance. It clouds spiritual perception and weakens faith. A heart burdened with offense cannot pray effectively because prayer flows best from love. Forgiveness is not approval of wrong. It is obedience to truth. It is a spiritual release that restores authority. When forgiveness is given, the flow of prayer is restored immediately. Demon number three, ignorance of the word. Ignorance is not innocence in the spirit realm. Prayer must be built on knowledge. When believers do not understand what belongs to them, they pray timidly instead of authoritatively. You cannot pray confidently beyond what you know. Ignorance causes believers to beg when they should declare, to plead when they should stand, and to ask God to do what He has already given them authority to enforce. The Word of God is the legal document of the believer. Prayer is not convincing God. It is enforcing what He has already spoken. The more you know the Word, the stronger your prayers become. Education in the Word produces confidence. Confidence produces bold prayer. Bold prayer produces results. Closing charge. Prayer works, faith works, God is faithful. But unbelief must be confronted. Unforgiveness must be removed. Ignorance must be replaced with knowledge. When these three demons are defeated, prayer stops being a struggle and becomes a lifestyle of victory. Stand on the word, walk in love, speak in faith. Prayer was never meant to fail. It was meant to prevail. Prayer was designed to function as a living spiritual exchange governed by divine principles. And when it appears ineffective, the failure is never rooted in God's unwillingness, but in conditions that interfere with the believer's ability to receive. One of the greatest interferences is unbelief, which is not simply a lack of emotion or enthusiasm, but a quiet resistance against truth. Unbelief questions what God has already spoken and replaces certainty with hesitation, turning prayer into a wish instead of an act of faith. Faith operates on revealed truth, not on circumstances, feelings, or past disappointments. And when a believer prays while inwardly doubting, the authority of prayer is weakened because faith and doubt cannot operate together. Another powerful interference is unforgiveness, which acts like a spiritual barrier within the heart. Unforgiveness is not merely an emotional issue, but a spiritual position that contradicts the very nature of prayer, because prayer flows through love, and love cannot function fully where offense is held. When unforgiveness remains, it disrupts spiritual sensitivity, weakens confidence before God, and allows internal conflict to hinder outward authority, making prayer strained and ineffective. Forgiveness, on the other hand, is not an endorsement of wrongdoing, but a spiritual release that restores alignment, clears the heart, and reopens the channel through which faith operates freely. A third major interference is ignorance of spiritual truth, which limits prayer not because power is absent, but because authority is misunderstood. Believers cannot confidently stand on promises they do not know, and uncertainty in knowledge leads to insecurity in prayer. Ignorance causes prayer to become repetitive, fearful, and passive, often filled with begging rather than confidence, because the believer is unsure of what has already been provided and what must be enforced through faith. Knowledge brings clarity, and clarity produces boldness, allowing prayer to move from desperation to expectation. Prayer was never meant to be an emotional struggle or a desperate attempt to gain attention. It was designed to be a confident response to established truth, exercised from a position of spiritual authority. When unbelief is confronted, forgiveness is practiced, and understanding is cultivated, prayer transforms from a religious habit into a powerful spiritual practice that produces consistent results. The strength of prayer is directly connected to the condition of the heart and the clarity of the mind, because faith must be rooted in truth, love must remain active, and understanding must guide expression. When these elements are aligned, prayer becomes steady, focused, and effective, not because of volume, repetition, or effort, but because it is anchored in spiritual order. In such a state, the believer no longer prays hoping something might happen, but prays knowing that what has been spoken aligns with divine will and spiritual law, creating confidence, peace, and expectation rather than frustration. Prayer then becomes less about struggle and more about partnership, less about pleading and more about standing, and less about uncertainty and more about assurance, producing a life where communication with God is marked by consistency, authority, and spiritual growth. Prayer is a spiritual operation governed by divine principles, and its effectiveness depends largely on the condition of the believer rather than the willingness of God. When prayer seems delayed or unproductive, the cause is often internal interference rather than external resistance. One major interference is unbelief, which subtly weakens prayer by challenging the reliability of truth. Unbelief does not always appear as open denial. More often, it shows up as uncertainty, hesitation, or mental conflict that questions whether what has been spoken will truly come to pass. Faith, however, is not rooted in feelings or visible evidence, but in settled confidence in truth. When prayer is offered without firm conviction, it loses its spiritual force and becomes a hopeful request rather than a declaration grounded in authority. Closely connected to this is the issue of unforgiveness, which restricts prayer by creating inner division. A heart burdened by offense struggles to operate freely because prayer flows best through love, clarity, and peace. Unforgiveness introduces tension into the inner life, weakening spiritual sensitivity and disrupting confidence. It causes prayer to feel heavy and strained, not because power is absent, but because alignment is broken. Forgiveness, in contrast, restores harmony within the heart, releasing emotional weight and reopening the flow of faith. It is a deliberate spiritual decision that clears internal resistance and strengthens confidence, allowing prayer to function as it was designed. When unbelief is replaced with trust, and unforgiveness is replaced with release, prayer shifts from an emotional effort into a steady expression of faith, marked by assurance rather than anxiety and expectation rather than doubt. Another major limitation in prayer is ignorance, which restricts spiritual effectiveness by limiting understanding of authority and responsibility. Ignorance does not mean lack of sincerity. Many sincere prayers struggle simply because knowledge is incomplete. When understanding is absent, prayer often becomes repetitive, cautious, and passive, filled with uncertainty about what is permissible to ask for or expect. This lack of clarity leads to inconsistency, where confidence rises and falls based on circumstances instead of remaining anchored in truth. Knowledge brings stability to prayer because it defines boundaries, clarifies expectations, and strengthens confidence. When understanding grows, prayer becomes more focused, deliberate, and assured, shifting from pleading to standing and from hoping to expecting. This transformation does not happen through emotional intensity, but through renewed thinking and disciplined belief. Prayer was never intended to be a desperate attempt to persuade heaven, but a confident response to establish spiritual realities. As understanding increases, fear diminishes, and prayer becomes calmer yet stronger, quieter yet more authoritative. The believer begins to pray with clarity of purpose, knowing what to declare, what to resist, and what to receive. This produces consistency. where prayer is no longer driven by crisis, but becomes a daily posture of confidence and alignment. When faith is settled, the heart is free, and understanding is clear, prayer operates smoothly and effectively, producing peace rather than frustration and assurance rather than confusion. In this state, prayer matures into a disciplined spiritual practice that strengthens character, deepens confidence, and sustains spiritual growth, allowing communication with God to remain stable, productive, and transformative over time. Prayer functions according to spiritual principles, and its effectiveness is deeply connected to the internal posture of the one praying rather than any limitation on the divine side. When prayer feels ineffective, delayed, or unproductive, the issue is often rooted in internal resistance that weakens confidence and authority. One of the most subtle yet damaging forms of resistance is unbelief, which does not always appear as outright rejection, but often manifests as quiet uncertainty, mental negotiation, or hesitation. Unbelief causes the mind to question truth instead of resting in it, turning prayer into an emotional exercise rather than a faith-driven action. When uncertainty dominates, prayer shifts from confidence to speculation, and instead of speaking with assurance, the believer waits for reassurance from circumstances. This weakens consistency and drains spiritual authority because faith and doubt cannot operate together. Alongside unbelief, inner conflict caused by unresolved offense creates another layer of resistance. When the heart carries resentment, bitterness, or unresolved tension, spiritual focus becomes divided. Prayer requires clarity and peace to flow freely, and when internal turmoil exists, prayer becomes strained and heavy. Forgiveness is often misunderstood as an emotional response, but in reality, it is a strategic spiritual decision that restores alignment. Releasing offense clears internal resistance, sharpens spiritual sensitivity, and restores confidence. When trust replaces doubt and forgiveness replaces offense, prayer begins to operate with steadiness, no longer driven by emotional fluctuation, but by settled conviction and inward peace. Another major factor that limits prayer is lack of understanding, which quietly reduces confidence and produces passivity. Ignorance does not cancel sincerity, but it restricts effectiveness because authority cannot exceed understanding. When clarity is missing, prayer becomes repetitive, uncertain, and cautious, often filled with vague requests rather than focused declarations. Without understanding, believers may pray earnestly yet inconsistently, allowing circumstances to dictate confidence instead of remaining anchored in truth. This produces a cycle where faith rises in moments of encouragement and collapses during difficulty. Understanding stabilizes prayer by defining expectations, clarifying responsibility, and removing confusion. As understanding increases, fear decreases, and prayer becomes more intentional and focused. The mind becomes disciplined, thoughts align with truth, and confidence grows steadily rather than fluctuating. Prayer then moves from reaction to intention, from emotional urgency to calm authority. Instead of attempting to persuade or negotiate, the believer learns to stand firmly, speaking with clarity and expectation. This produces endurance in prayer, where consistency replaces desperation and discipline replaces emotional impulse. Over time, understanding transforms prayer into a structured spiritual practice that strengthens confidence and produces reliability rather than inconsistency. As prayer matures, it shifts from being crisis-driven to becoming a continual posture of alignment and confidence. When faith is settled, the heart is free from offense, and understanding is clear, prayer becomes less about effort and more about flow. The believer no longer approaches prayer with anxiety, wondering whether it will work, but with assurance that it operates according to established spiritual order. This produces peace rather than frustration and expectation rather than uncertainty. Prayer becomes quieter yet stronger, calmer yet more authoritative, because it is no longer fueled by desperation but by confidence. In this state, communication with God becomes consistent and stable, not dependent on emotion, urgency, or circumstance. The believer learns to speak deliberately, think clearly, and remain steady regardless of external pressure. Prayer then strengthens character, disciplines the mind, and deepens spiritual maturity, shaping not only outcomes, but also identity. Over time, this produces a lifestyle where prayer is not viewed as a struggle or last resort, but as a reliable spiritual practice that sustains growth, reinforces confidence, and maintains alignment. When these internal conditions are cultivated, prayer operates as it was intended, producing stability, clarity, and lasting spiritual effectiveness. Prayer operates within a spiritual framework that requires alignment of belief, attitude, and understanding, and when it appears ineffective, the disruption, always originates within the individual rather than from any limitation in divine response. One of the most common internal disruptions is unbelief, which weakens prayer not by rejecting truth outright, but by diluting confidence in it. Unbelief often presents itself as hesitation, internal debate, or reliance on visible evidence rather than settled conviction. When a person prays while mentally questioning whether the request will truly be fulfilled, prayer loses its firmness and becomes conditional. This internal uncertainty fragments focus and shifts prayer from confident expression to emotional negotiation. Faith, by contrast, is a position of rest and certainty, not because circumstances are favorable, but because truth is trusted. When belief is unstable, prayer fluctuates in intensity and consistency, rising in moments of hope and collapsing in moments of difficulty. This instability creates exhaustion rather than peace. Alongside unbelief, unresolved inner conflict further weakens prayer. When resentment, offense, or bitterness are present, the heart becomes divided and spiritual focus is scattered. Prayer requires clarity and internal agreement to flow effectively, and inner resistance disrupts that flow. Forgiveness is often misunderstood as an emotional act, but it is primarily a conscious decision to release internal resistance. When forgiveness is withheld, emotional tension consumes mental energy, weakening spiritual attentiveness and confidence. Releasing offense restores internal harmony, allowing prayer to move from strain to ease and from tension to clarity. A second major limitation arises from lack of understanding, which quietly undermines confidence and produces passive engagement. Ignorance does not imply lack of sincerity. Many individuals pray earnestly, yet struggle consistently because they lack clarity about spiritual authority and respo. Instability. Without understanding, prayer becomes reactive rather than intentional, driven by immediate pressure instead of grounded in steady conviction. This results in repetitive patterns where the same concerns are revisited without resolution, not due to absence of power, but due to absence of clarity. When understanding is limited, prayer often becomes filled with uncertainty, vague language, and emotional pleading. This approach exhausts the mind and creates frustration because expectations are unclear and confidence is unstable. Understanding brings structure to prayer by defining what can be expected, how to stand confidently, and when to remain steady. As clarity increases, prayer becomes more focused, deliberate, and calm. Fear diminishes because uncertainty diminishes. The individual begins to approach prayer with intention rather than urgency, clarity rather than confusion. This shift transforms prayer from an emotional outlet into a disciplined spiritual practice. With understanding, thoughts become organized, words become purposeful, and confidence becomes consistent. Prayer then operates less as a response to crisis and more as a continual posture of alignment, producing steadiness instead of fluctuation. As prayer matures through belief, forgiveness, and understanding, it transitions from being emotionally driven to being spiritually grounded. Instead of relying on intensity or repetition, prayer becomes effective through clarity and consistency. Emotional intensity may fluctuate, but conviction remains steady. The individual no longer feels compelled to prove sincerity through effort or volume because confidence is anchored internally. This maturity produces peace, not because challenges disappear, but because stability replaces anxiety. Prayer ceases to feel like a struggle and begins to feel like cooperation with established principles. When inner resistance is removed and understanding is strengthened, prayer becomes less exhausting and more sustaining. The mind remains focused, the heart remains clear, and confidence remains intact regardless of external pressure. This consistency allows prayer to influence behavior, decisions, and perspective, not just circumstances. The individual becomes more patient, disciplined, and resilient because prayer reinforces internal stability rather than an emotional dependency. Over time, prayer shapes character by cultivating clarity, self-control, and endurance. It becomes a daily practice that sustains growth rather than an emergency response driven by urgency. Ultimately, prayer reaches its highest effectiveness when it is approached as a disciplined partnership rather than a desperate appeal. When belief is settled, the heart is free from unresolved offense, and understanding is continually developed. Prayer operates smoothly and confidently. The individual no longer measures effectiveness by immediate visible outcomes, but by internal alignment and peace. This produces long-term stability rather than short-term relief. Prayer becomes quieter yet stronger, calmer yet more authoritative, because it is no longer driven by fear or uncertainty. Instead of reacting emotionally to circumstances, the individual remains composed, focused, and assured. This stability influences daily life, strengthening decision-making, emotional control, and spiritual maturity. Prayer then becomes an ongoing posture rather than an occasional activity, reinforcing confidence and clarity over time. In this state, prayer fulfills its intended purpose, not only producing results, but shaping perspective, discipline, and inner strength, allowing spiritual growth to remain consistent, sustainable, and deeply transformative. Prayer functions within an established spiritual order, and its effectiveness is deeply influenced by the internal condition of the one who prays rather than by any reluctance on the divine side. When prayer feels weak, delayed, or inconsistent, the cause is often found in inner misalignment rather than external opposition. One of the most subtle obstacles is unbelief, which does not always appear as open doubt, but often disguises itself as hesitation, overthinking, or reliance on visible evidence. Unbelief divides the mind, causing a person to pray while simultaneously questioning whether the prayer will have any effect. This inner conflict drains confidence and turns prayer into a cautious experiment instead of a firm spiritual action. Faith, by contrast, is not emotional excitement, but settled trust rooted in truth. When trust is unstable, prayer becomes inconsistent, strong one moment and weak the next, rising with hope and collapsing with disappointment. This instability produces fatigue rather than peace and causes prayer to feel like a struggle. When belief is stabilized, prayer becomes calmer and more confident, no longer driven by urgency but by assurance, allowing it to operate with consistency rather than fluctuation. Another internal condition that interferes with prayer is unresolved offense, which quietly disrupts focus and spiritual sensitivity. When resentment, bitterness, or unresolved conflict is held within the heart, attention becomes divided and emotional energy is consumed by internal tension. Prayer requires clarity, agreement, and inward peace to flow effectively, and offense fractures that clarity. Many struggle in prayer not because they lack sincerity, but because their inner world is burdened by unresolved issues that create resistance. Forgiveness is often misunderstood as an emotional response or a sign of weakness, but it is actually a strategic decision that restores internal alignment. Releasing offense does not deepen pain or justify wrongdoing. It removes internal barriers that restrict confidence and clarity. When forgiveness is practiced, emotional weight is lifted, mental focus improves, and spiritual attentiveness is restored. Prayer then becomes less strained and more fluid, moving from forced effort to natural expression. A clear heart allows prayer to be steady and focused, free from the distractions of internal conflict, producing peace rather than agitation. A further limitation arises from lack of understanding, which restricts prayer by limiting confidence and clarity. Ignorance does not cancel sincerity, but it does reduce effectiveness because authority cannot operate beyond knowledge. When understanding is limited, prayer often becomes repetitive, vague, and cautious, filled with uncertainty about what is appropriate to expect. This uncertainty causes inconsistency, where confidence rises temporarily and then fades when circumstances change. Without understanding, prayer becomes reactive rather than intentional, driven by emotional pressure instead of disciplined belief. Understanding brings structure and direction, allowing prayer to be focused and deliberate rather than scattered. As clarity increases, fear decreases because uncertainty loses its influence. The individual begins to approach prayer with purpose rather than desperation, knowing how to stand confidently rather than hoping for reassurance. This shift transforms prayer from an emotional outlet into a disciplined spiritual practice, producing stability instead of fluctuation and confidence instead of confusion. As belief becomes settled, offense is released, and understanding grows. Prayer matures from being emotionally driven into being spiritually grounded. It no longer depends on intensity, repetition, or urgency to feel effective. Instead, it operates through clarity, consistency, and confidence. Emotional intensity may rise and fall, but conviction remains steady. The individual no longer feels pressure to prove sincerity through effort because assurance is already established internally. Prayer becomes quieter yet stronger, calmer yet more authoritative because it flows from alignment rather than anxiety. This maturity reduces frustration and increases endurance, allowing prayer to be sustained over time rather than abandoned when emotions fade. Prayer begins to influence not only circumstances but also perspective, behavior, and decision-making. It cultivates patience, discipline, and resilience, shaping character as much as outcomes. Over time, prayer becomes less about immediate relief and more about maintaining alignment, reinforcing stability rather than reacting to pressure. Ultimately, prayer reaches its highest effectiveness when it is practiced as a consistent posture rather than an occasional response to crisis. When belief is firm, the heart is free from unresolved conflict, and understanding is continually developed. Prayer operates smoothly and confidently. The individual no longer measures success solely by immediate results, but by internal peace, clarity, and steadiness. This produces long-term growth rather than short-term emotional relief. Prayer becomes a stabilizing force that strengthens inner life, sharpens focus, and sustains confidence regardless of external conditions. Instead of reacting emotionally to challenges, the individual remains composed and assured, grounded in disciplined belief. In this state, prayer fulfills its intended purpose by fostering inner strength, clarity, and maturity, creating a life marked by consistency, confidence, and sustained spiritual effectiveness over time. Prayer operates within an established spiritual order, and its effectiveness is determined largely by the internal alignment of the one who prays rather than by any limitation in divine response. When prayer feels weak, delayed, or inconsistent, the issue is often internal resistance rather than lack of sincerity. One of the most common sources of resistance is unbelief, which rarely appears as open rejection, but often disguises itself as hesitation, overanalysis, or dependence on visible evidence. This inner uncertainty divides the mind, causing prayer to be spoken outwardly while questioned inwardly. When this division exists, prayer loses firmness and becomes tentative, driven more by emotion than conviction. Faith, however, is not emotional intensity, but settled confidence rooted in truth. When confidence is unstable, prayer fluctuates in strength, rising with encouragement and collapsing under pressure. This instability produces exhaustion instead of peace. When belief becomes steady, prayer shifts from effort to assurance, allowing it to operate consistently without being affected by changing circumstances. Another internal condition that interferes with prayer is unresolved offense, which quietly drains focus and spiritual clarity. When resentment, bitterness, or unresolved conflict is held within the heart, attention becomes fragmented and emotional energy is consumed internally. Prayer requires inward agreement and peace to flow effectively, and offense creates internal resistance that disrupts this flow. Many struggle in prayer not because they lack devotion, but because unresolved emotional tension weakens concentration and confidence. Forgiveness is often misunderstood as an emotional reaction or a denial of pain, but it is primarily a deliberate decision to release internal resistance. Holding offense strengthens emotional attachment to past injury, while forgiveness restores internal balance. When forgiveness is practiced, mental clarity improves, emotional weight is lifted, and focus is restored. Prayer then becomes less strained and more natural, no longer hindered by internal distraction. A heart free from offense allows prayer to function with steadiness, clarity, and peace rather than tension and fatigue. Lack of understanding is another factor that restricts prayer by limiting confidence and direction. Ignorance does not imply lack of sincerity, but it does reduce effectiveness because confidence cannot exceed understanding. When clarity is absent, prayer often becomes repetitive, cautious, and unfocused, filled with uncertainty about what can be expected or how to remain steady. This uncertainty leads to inconsistency, where confidence rises briefly and then fades when circumstances change. Without understanding, prayer becomes reactive instead of intentional, driven by ional urgency rather than disciplined belief. Understanding brings structure to prayer by defining expectations and removing confusion. As clarity increases, fear diminishes because uncertainty loses its influence. The individual begins to pray with purpose rather than desperation, speaking with calm assurance instead of anxious repetition. This transformation turns prayer into a disciplined practice rather than an emotional release, producing stability instead of fluctuation and confidence instead of doubt. As belief stabilizes, offense is released, and understanding increases, prayer matures from an emotionally driven activity into a spiritually grounded practice. It no longer depends on intensity, repetition, or urgency to feel effective. Emotional energy may rise and fall, but conviction remains steady. The individual no longer feels pressure to prove sincerity through effort or persistence because assurance is already established internally. Prayer becomes quieter yet stronger, calmer yet more authoritative because it flows from alignment rather than anxiety. This maturity allows prayer to be sustained over time rather than abandoned when emotions fade. Prayer begins to shape perspective, influence decisions, and strengthen discipline. Not just address immediate concerns, it cultivates patience, resilience, and focus, producing internal stability rather than emotional dependency. Over time, prayer becomes a source of strength rather than strain, reinforcing consistency instead of exhaustion. As prayer becomes more consistent, it transitions from being crisis-driven to becoming a continual posture of alignment. Instead of being activated only in moments of pressure, prayer becomes an ongoing expression of confidence and clarity. The individual no longer approaches prayer with uncertainty about whether it will be effective, but with assurance rooted in belief. This removes anxiety and replaces it with peace, allowing prayer to be practiced without strain. Stability develops because prayer is no longer dependent on external circumstances or emotional motivation. The mind remains focused, the heart remains clear, and confidence remains intact even when conditions change. This consistency strengthens inner life, producing emotional balance and mental clarity. Prayer becomes less about seeking relief and more about maintaining alignment, reinforcing steadiness rather than reacting to stress. Ultimately, prayer reaches its fullest effectiveness when it is practiced as a stable discipline rather than an occasional response to difficulty. When belief is settled, the heart is free from unresolved conflict, and understanding continues to grow. Prayer operates smoothly and confidently. The individual no longer measures effectiveness solely by immediate outcomes, but by internal peace, clarity, and endurance. This produces long-term growth rather than short-term emotional relief. Prayer becomes a stabilizing force that shapes character, sharpens focus, and strengthens resilience. Instead of reacting emotionally to challenges, the individual remains composed and assured, grounded in steady conviction. In this state, prayer fulfills its intended purpose by sustaining clarity, reinforcing confidence, and producing lasting inner strength, allowing spiritual growth to remain consistent, balanced, and transformative over time. Prayer operates within an established spiritual framework, and its effectiveness is shaped primarily by the internal alignment of the one who prays, rather than by any reluctance on the divine side. When prayer feels weak or unproductive, the root cause is often an inner condition that disrupts confidence and focus. One such condition is unbelief, which rarely appears as outright denial, but often manifests as hesitation, internal debate, or reliance on circumstances for reassurance. This kind of divided thinking causes prayer to lose firmness, turning it into a tentative attempt rather than a confident spiritual act. Faith, however, is not emotional intensity, but settled assurance. When assurance is absent, prayer fluctuates in strength, rising when hope is high and fading when pressure increases. This instability produces frustration instead of peace and leads many to conclude that prayer itself is unreliable, when in reality, the issue lies in the lack of inward certainty that sustains consistent confidence. Another internal disruption that weakens prayer is unresolved offense, which quietly consumes emotional and mental energy. When resentment or bitterness is allowed to remain, attention becomes fragmented and inner peace is disturbed. Prayer requires clarity and agreement within the heart to flow freely, and offense introduces resistance that interferes with that flow. Many struggle to remain focused or confident in prayer, not because they lack devotion, but because unresolved emotional conflict creates inner noise. Forgiveness is often misunderstood as an emotional reaction or a denial of injustice, but it is actually a deliberate decision to release internal resistance. Holding offense anchors the mind to past injury, while forgiveness restores internal balance and clarity. When offense is released, emotional weight lifts, concentration improves, and prayer becomes less strained and more natural, flowing from peace rather than tension. A further limitation arises from lack of understanding, which restricts prayer by limiting confidence and direction. Ignorance does not imply insincerity, but it does weaken effectiveness because confidence cannot exceed understanding. When clarity is lacking, prayer often becomes repetitive, vague, and cautious, filled with uncertainty about what is reasonable to expect. This uncertainty creates inconsistency, where confidence rises briefly and then collapses when circumstances change. Without an understanding, prayer becomes reactive instead of intentional, driven by emotional urgency rather than disciplined conviction. Understanding provides structure by clarifying expectations and reducing confusion. As clarity grows, fear diminishes because uncertainty loses its influence. Prayer then becomes more focused and deliberate, moving away from anxious repetition toward calm assurance. As belief stabilizes, offense is released, and understanding increases. Prayer begins to mature from an emotionally driven activity into a grounded spiritual discipline. It no longer depends on intensity, repetition, or urgency to feel effective. Emotional energy may fluctuate, but conviction remains steady. The individual no longer feels pressure to prove sincerity through effort, because confidence is already established internally. Prayer becomes quieter yet stronger, calmer yet more authoritative, because it flows from alignment rather than anxiety. This maturity reduces frustration and increases endurance, allowing prayer to continue steadily over time rather than fading when emotions subside. Prayer starts to influence perspective and behavior, not just immediate concerns, shaping patience, discipline, and resilience. As this maturity deepens, prayer shifts from being crisis-oriented to becoming a continual posture of alignment. Instead of being activated only in moments of pressure, it becomes a consistent expression of confidence and clarity. The individual no longer approaches prayer wondering whether it will work, but practices it with settled assurance. This removes anxiety and replaces it with peace, allowing prayer to be sustained without strain. Stability develops because prayer is no longer dependent on emotional motivation or external circumstances. The mind remains focused, the heart remains clear, and confidence remains intact even when situations change. Prayer becomes a stabilizing influence that strengthens emotional balance and mental clarity. Over time, consistent prayer reinforces discipline and inner strength, rather than emotional dependency. It trains the mind to remain steady, the heart to remain clear, and the perspective to remain balanced. Instead of reacting impulsively to challenges, the individual responds thoughtfully and calmly. Prayer becomes less about seeking immediate relief and more about maintaining internal order and clarity. This consistency allows growth to occur gradually and sustainably, reducing burnout and discouragement. Prayer becomes a source of renewal rather than exhaustion, reinforcing confidence rather than draining it. Through repetition and discipline, it shapes character and strengthens resolve. Ultimately, prayer reaches its fullest effectiveness when it is practiced as a stable discipline rather than an occasional response to difficulty. When belief is settled, the heart is free from unresolved conflict, and understanding continues to grow. Prayer operates smoothly and confidently. Effectiveness is no longer measured solely by immediate results, but by internal peace, clarity, and endurance. This produces long-term stability, rather than short-term emotional relief. Prayer becomes a consistent force that sharpens focus, strengthens resilience, and sustains growth. In this state, prayer fulfills its purpose by cultivating inner strength, reinforcing confidence, and maintaining alignment, allowing spiritual development to remain steady, balanced, and transformative over time.